Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Martin.
And I am Tammy Martin.
And we are the founders of Young Black Leadership Alliance. YBLA is a nonprofit organization that focuses on building leaders and young Black men and women starting in high school through college and into their young professional careers. Our program is based on three pillars of leadership, community service, and college and career readiness. Our mission is to build leaders that will make a positive impact on their peers, communities, and eventually the world.
Yeah, that is right. So we are always like to start our conversation today by thanking our partners at DHG for starting the charge on this initiative to end racial injustice and inequality in the Black community. We thank their team for all the support on making this a reality. So if this is your first time joining us, the YBLA Community Conversation Initiative is about taking a stand against racial inequality and injustice. We are using the acronym STAND to describe this initiative. And STAND is for seize the moment, talk to others, act on your biases, no more silence, and donate your resources. We invite you to stand with us to make a better tomorrow in the Charlotte community. We have a target goal of having 2020 actions towards bridging the gap of racial disparities. So if you missed any of the conversations, no worries. Please visit our website at youngblackleadership.org/community-conversations.
Welcome to the 13th segment.
13th.
Of YBLA Community Conversations.
Yeah.
Today, our conversation will be different from the previous segments. In fact, our
Yes.
next two segments will be like mini training sessions
Right.
on diversity, equity, and
We're
inclusion.
going back to school.
Yeah, during the next hour, you will hear from an executive consultant that will educate us in three areas. They are diversity, unconscious bias, and conscious inclusion. After each area, there will be a Q&A, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat during his presentation.
Yeah.
Our goal with offering these segments are to help start building a culture of inclusion in your workplace. I'm sure that all can agree it's going to take each one of us doing a small part to move the needle towards a better tomorrow.
Right.
So we ask you to text a friend, a coworker, ask them to join us on this very important segment.
Yes, so true. So to give you an update on our 2020 actions and how we're doing on our progress, we're going to ask our leader, Abuna, to give us a report.
Abuna, come on in here, Abuna.
Yes.
Awesome.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Abuna Uche, and I am a junior at Ohio University. Right now, we are at 1,541 actions.
All right, all right.
Meaning we are at 76% of the way to our 2020 action goal.
All right.
76%. That is so awesome.
We
We're
believe
there.
that.
Wow.
76%.
76 whole percent. Nice.
Thank you, Abuna, for that update. To prepare for next year. Yes, we're thinking about next year.
2021.
John and I want to get some feedback from you. We really, really appreciate and thank you so much for tuning in to our community conversations. We thank you for participating in the actions and supporting this effort to create a better tomorrow for this generation and especially the next one. Warren Buffett once said, someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago.
Wow.
So this initiative is like planting trees of justice, equality, equity, and opportunity for all people. Because of your support and because of our passion to build a better tomorrow, especially for our young people, YBLA will continue this initiative next year with the tagline of Stand 21, Closing the Gap.
Closing the gap. Nice.
Yes.
All right. So to plan for next year, we want your input.
Yes.
So on the screen, you will see a link to take a quick survey. We'll also drop that in the poll, So Abuna, please drop that in the chat. In the chat.
Yeah.
All right. So please take the next 2 minutes. We're going to do it really quickly to take our survey. This will also go towards our 2020 goals.
Right.
So Abuna, please drop that in the chat. Hopefully, it's on the screen right now, so you guys can see that. You can scan the QR code with your phone, or just go directly to that poll.
Yeah, we really want to hear from you to get some input on, what would you like to hear next year?
Yes. Also, as you guys are doing it, I do see some folks dropping in the chat where they're from. I see someone from Arkansas. Very nice. Someone from DHG. We got Atlanta. Nice, nice, nice. You guys are so awesome. Eric, you're going to have a great group of folks on the call today. It's going to be
Yes,
awesome.
exactly. So take that link there and please help us for next year on what things we can do to serve you better and continue to educate
Yes,
the community about moving this needle here, because that's what we all want. We want a better tomorrow for not only us, but definitely for our children.
yes. I see someone from Memphis. I see someone from
Yeah.
Jacksonville, someone from Richmond, Virginia. So folks
Mhm.
probably don't know. I used to live in Virginia myself. I see someone from Tyson's Corner, which is right near where I used to live. So we have a national audience on the phone here. So
Yeah.
I'm so excited about that.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
because part of the goal for next year is to really broaden that audience
absolutely.
and make it more of a nationwide, and to start talking goals for the nation, not just the Charlotte community. So we want to
Absolutely.
be able to take a broader reach.
Yeah, we got a couple seconds here on the poll. I see that. I see Austin, Texas. I see NYC, New York
All
City
right, New York.
on there. Of course, we have Charlotte. Cannot
Yes.
forget about Charlotte, of course. Richmond,
Raleigh.
Austin, Texas. Nice, nice.
Yes, we really appreciate you guys joining us today.
Yes.
We're all going to learn something, because every time Mr. Watson speaks, we all learning, write nuggets down.
Yes.
Definitely.
All right. Well, we should be wrapping it back up. Let's
Yep.
go ahead and get this thing started.
Yeah, so please, if you haven't finished it, please do take the time as we continue on this segment. All right. Thank you, everyone, for doing that for us. Now, let's get to it. Our guest facilitator today is a leader in the DE&I space. He is one of our board members, probably 5+ years.
At least.
At least,
Yep.
yeah. And he's a great mentor to John and I both, and we
Awesome.
consider him a friend. I am so proud to introduce Mr. Eric Watson. So we are going to let Eric introduce himself, where you work, your role, all those years of experience, and answer one question for us, Eric. We want to know, which is harder for people or companies to adopt? Is it the diversity, the equity, or the inclusion?
All right. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. Great to be on the YBLA board. Great to work with John and Tammy and the rest of the board members, and obviously with the young people who make us all look good. I want to start out by also saying that that question is sort of an obvious one. We've been doing diversity a long time. We talked about inclusion, but equity has come into the framework basically because we've not recognized the need for equity. My best example is, if you buy a home and pay on it for 30 years and don't have the deed, there's a sense that there's not been equity. If you buy a car and pay it off and don't have the title, there's some equity there that you're owed. And I think what we found in the last year or so, that there's populations that equity has not been part of their life experience. So glad to be here. Eric Watson with the Kaleidoscope Group, executive consultant, originally from Charlotte, but I spent 35 years in corporate America in insurance, oil and gas, grocery retail. I ran a nonprofit with the Minority Supplier Development Council here in Charlotte, developing minority businesses for 5 years. And then the last 2 years, I've been with the Kaleidoscope Group as an executive consultant. So I'm excited to be here, and let's jump right in. We're going to start with what some of you may say is remedial, but it's foundational. And that is just starting with understanding diversity. And before I get too far in, my tech support, my expert is named Eric also. So when you hear me say next slide, Eric, I'm not speaking in the third person. That's the Eric on the tech. So understanding diversity. Eric, let's go to the next slide. Which point of view do you relate to the most? Bottom line impact or the right thing to do? Now, I would tell you in the last 6 months, focus have been really looking at the right thing to do, especially in corporate, because in a lot of ways, that was not a focus. It was more bottom line impact. And focusing on bottom line impact, so to pull people away, are we doing the right things? I would say you got to do both. But depending on your business, your industry, and maybe even your geography, you've got to have a balance on which one is more important. Lastly, from a capitalistic standpoint, there's no business that doesn't have a budget or financial responsibility. So you got to understand your bottom line. So if we move to the next slide, it talked about developing the evolution of this work. There is a reality that this started with a lot of folks staying out of trouble or getting out of trouble. And then it moved to, people being nice. This valuing and leveraging differences moves into the strategic framework. It talks about being innovative, the things you get from having a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. Then we move to unconscious bias. Now, understand unconscious bias is only awareness. It makes you more aware of things you need to know. The real end state gets to, are we consciously inclusive? And that's where we've got to go. But that takes some work. It's not just automatic. And that's why unconscious bias is so important to get to conscious inclusion. So let's look at the next slide and talk a little bit about why it matters. Now, I want to say that this foundation conversation is important. Why? Because we've spent more time in this space talking about how to do it and why to do it. And we really don't understand what we're doing. But there is an understanding as to why it's important. So just over a few matters of detail, there is companies are 2 times as likely to meet or exceed their financial targets, 3 times as likely to be more high performing than their competitors, 6 times more likely to be more innovative and agile, and 8 times more likely to achieve better outcomes. So when you think about it, most businesses can figure out, why is this good for my business? But understand, very seldom are any of these always operating in the same manner. Also, there will be others. So you need to understand and be able to articulate, what is it that drives our business success from this work? Now let's move to some of the terms, inclusive DE&I terms. One of the challenges is the terms have come and we get more locked into terms than doing work. So there's diversity, which talks about the variety and ability of skills, experience, cultural background, and stakeholders. Diversity, I would say, is all the ways that we differ. Equity, establishing policies, procedures that promote fair opportunities and outcomes for all. Equity is based on needs. And then inclusion, and that's being valued. So when you think about those statements, let's move to a place that I think has probably been more realistic today. And a lot of you probably seen this example of the kids standing on boxes and looking over a fence. This is really important because of the fact that we spent so much time on equality. And equality is giving people the same thing and hoping they're in an equal space, and they're not. That's how equity today has become more relevant, because we now recognize people have different needs. Equality is sameness, equity is needs. And that's where organizations have to move to understand, what are the different and diverse needs of my staff versus how do I give everyone the same thing? Then there is a reality that has come up in the last 6 months, mainly around COVID, George Floyd, that even when you give some folks more, it still is not going to balance the equation from economics and health. So we move to the last quadrant, which is removing barriers for everyone, making it free for everyone, being unified in how we move forward. The next area of foundation is dimensions of diversity. Now, these are simple, and we've probably gone through this years and years again, but it's important. Primary diversity dimensions are things we can see, and it could be age, race, gender. Secondary are those things that you probably can't see, like education, marital status, or even military experience. So primary you see, secondary you can't. Then there's workplace, which workplace diversity has existed forever. Level, location, and function have always existed in the workplace. Level, you're only going to have one CEO. Function, people who work in certain functions, particularly operations, are going to have a bigger budget than the staff. And then if you're in a different location, information you get, certain things you get are going to be different. That diversity has always existed. And then style. Style relates to the culture of the organization. leadership style, work habits, performance expectations. Those are things that set the culture. So when you think about the organization's diversity, it's not just race and gender. It is the things that drive who we are. And that's not just what we see, it's also those things we don't see. It's the culture we operate in, and it's the business that you're in. So that's sort of the dimensions, that's that foundational piece. Why don't we stop and see if there's some questions? Now, one of the things that I omitted to say to you that I want you to do right now, I want you to take and put your pencil, or for the balance of this presentation, use your non-dominant hand. So there's nobody there to keep you accountable but you. But if you're writing and taking notes, put your pencil in your non-dominant hand. If you're using your PDA or if you're using a computer, I want you to only type with your non-dominant hand. Okay? You're the only accountability person, so we'll see how that goes. So Tammy, do we have any questions in the chat? What questions would people have about the foundational piece?
Well, actually, I have a question. So you started us off and you said use our non-dominant hand. So just to make sure I'm clear, I'm a right-handed, and you want me to use my left hand to write these questions down. You want me to, if I'm doing it in the chat, you want me to use my left hand to put my questions in the chat.
There you go.
If you're using your cell phone, you got the text in your question using your non-dominant hand.
How long do we have? It's going to take me a while to get through this, but I definitely appreciate that.
Okay.
We actually have some questions.
Okay.
And then again, folks in the audience, please feel free to throw some questions in the chat.
It might be a little harder now since you got to use your non-dominant hand.
You should have got there before.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, but yeah, John, now we have some questions, Eric. The first one, why do you think we focus more on the bottom line and not on it's the right thing to do?
Wow.
Oh, okay. Great question. Well, one, years ago when I first started in this work, there was a gentleman named Roosevelt Thomas said, beyond race and gender, because this work came out of what you call affirmative action, or EEO, and it was solely based on race and gender. So when you move beyond that, you'd have to think, so what does diversity do for the business? So you got to tie to a business case. And when it was, race and gender, it did not create value for people. And in fact, the reason it was pushed so much is all it did is drive numbers, not value. So when you think about people who are different or things that are different that are recognized, that are valued, then you get better results. So that's why we focus more on business, because it's going to get traction. We live in a capitalistic society. Whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, finance is going to come into the picture. Good question.
Absolutely.
So to add on to that, Eric, just my thought is, when I talk to most companies, most businesses that we work with, they don't really think about it from that ROI perspective, because you talked about like making sure, again, beyond it's the right thing to do, knowing the numbers. Why is that important? Like, why does a leader or someone else need to understand that the dollars is important?
Well, there's a reality that, there's opportunities to be more successful when you understand the diversity markets that you don't access. So there's also the value that your organization with people that are valued, they're more productive. And people who are valued are going to give you more effort most times than you expect. They'll give you a discretionary effort when they feel valued. And then there's the whole reality that when you have an organization that is made up of teams, different functions, whether you talk about race or gender or not, an organization is already diverse. And if you don't know how to work across lines of functions, levels, and locations, you're not going to be successful. So it has to tie to the business. And we all know, if you've been in business, the people who make the most money usually get the most recognition. So that's where it goes. That's where we have moved, I think, sometimes too far along that continuum and forgot that you're making money. You got to value the people that are helping you make money.
Good point. Eric, one of the questions that I have is the slide. Actually, one of my favorite slides in your deck was the one that you showed the description of equality, equity, reality, and liberation.
Yeah.
Part of this initiative is about literally moving us from the reality one to liberation. What do you think? What are some of your suggestions on what just everyday people, everybody that's on the audience, that's listening, individuals, what can we do to start moving the reality towards liberation? Simple things that we can do.
It's a great point. And I will give you an example that's probably, a bit controversial, but it is what it is. So one, you got to spend time hearing and listening to other people, because I filter information based on my experience. So the classic example is Black Lives Matters, all lives matter. And so when someone says that, it doesn't mean that I don't think all lives matter,
right?
But Black Lives Matter too. So the example that I best use, if my wife were to ask me, honey, do you love me? And I said, I love everybody. That's not going to quite land in the right way.
That's true.
So you got to understand that there's a filter of which people have experienced the world, they've experienced life. And that filter matters when it talks about them. So one of the things that you got to do is be in different places. And we'll talk about this a little bit more with different people so you can have those experiences, but be more in tune to listening versus talking. And that's the opportunity.
Wow. I'm going to try that all love matters with Tammy.
No, that ain't going to work. that was actually a great analogy,
That is
Eric.
an awesome analogy.
Analogy.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah. As a good segue to this last question I have is the race conversation is so prevalent now, specifically, relating to Black employees and customers. How do you avoid excluding others?
Wow.
Well, see, I think that when you do this work strategically, I'll go back to equity. There's a need right now to focus on race. And as long as I've been doing this work, in a lot of ways, people said it's beyond race and gender, remember? But think about the most recent efforts that we've had to focus on. Me Too, which was gender, a year or so ago, and race. Now, we said we were beyond that. Well, obviously, we're not. And so it's important to focus on those things. But let's say a year from now, it becomes ability, meaning working with people with disabilities. You have to focus on where there's the need, and failure to do that and focus on everything means you're not going to be successful. It's just like if you run a business and all you're going to do is focus in one area to the detriment of other, you got to have balance. But if you're making money in a certain market, you're going to go to that market and make sure you make it. Make sense?
Yeah.
It does. It does. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Eric, when you lean forward, the camera cuts the top of your head. You look so excited. There you go. Just a little bit more. You look so excited in there.
There we go.
Hey, I want to make sure they get the full Eric Watson.
All right.
And love the bow tie. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's his signature.
Thank you, John. Now they can see my gray hair, but that's okay.
That is so great.
Okay, Eric, we can now move on to the next area of unconscious bias.
All right, so unconscious bias, and this builds on some of the conversation we just had, and you've got a picture of an iceberg. And that iceberg, when you look at unconscious bias, shows us what we can see, which is those primary dimensions I talked about. And then there's below the waterline, there's a lot more of the iceberg than you can see. Those are the secondary dimensions. So think that as we think about ourselves, we probably see less of individuals than who they really are. So when you see me as a Black man, you don't know my marital status, military status, religion. Those things are all under the waterline. So the practice, to your point, when you ask, how do we get better? You got to lower the waterline. You got to be able to expose more of who you are. You got to share that. That's a practice that you start with yourself. How do I give people access of more of who Eric is so that they get to know me? In doing so, I create trust, and guess what they do? They lower their waterline. And that's where the mutual respect, trust, and the growth happens. But unconscious bias lies in the fact that a lot of times we only act on what we see, which is above the waterline. Therein lies the ability for me to make mistakes around what I'm doing. But let's talk about bias a little bit more. On the next slide, we talk about the definition of bias. And we have naturally, as we do from times, we made bias neutral to negative. Bias is just a preference for or against. and we've created it as a negative. So when you go to the next slide, the science of bias, and you look at the science of it, we process 11 million bits of information per second. Only 40 bits of that is consciously processed. 99.99996% is unconsciously processed. So the majority of what we do is unconscious. It's just natural. Like we breathe, we blink our eyes. So that's what makes unconscious bias so challenging for us. So let's take a look at the types of bias. There's unconscious, which is the things that we don't know. And we've heard the saying, we don't know what we don't know. But then there's conscious. There's the things that we know we're biased to. And we all have biases. We know that we have biases, and sometimes we push out on those. So we know those, they're explicit. But then there's group bias, which is when there's a large group of people who have a bias. Now, I'll ask you to think about it, and hopefully you're writing with your non-dominant hand. Which one of these would you say has the most negative impact? Unconscious bias, conscious bias, doing something that's biased because you know it, or group? Well, the answer is unconscious bias, because you don't know what you don't know. Now, a lot of people choose group because it's the numbers. But if you think about a group, you know, a large group of people are biased to war. That's not a negative thing. That's a good bias. But when people are unconscious, it's when you have the ability, the chance to do the most damage. So let me stop, take a break. We've talked about bias, and see if there's any questions that's been written with their non-dominant hand in the chat. Any questions that you have about bias and how the impact of bias is having an effect on who we are individually and organizationally?
Yeah, so I don't know if Blaine did this with his undominant hand or non-dominant hand. So Blaine, put it in the chat. Let me know if this was with your non-dominant hand.
But if that was pretty good.
It was an awesome question. So I'm going to
Okay.
read it because I don't want to paraphrase it. It's so good.
Okay.
It says, as a white male, I've found that oftentimes when I enter a place where I'm the minority, the Black community goes out of their way to help me feel at home. I want to reciprocate, but I don't want to offend anyone by calling out the fact that they're the minority. Any coaching?
Yeah. So one, let me compliment you on the fact that you put yourself in that place. And Blaine, you must have read my slides, because that's the next section. So the way that you grow is being in a place where you're not in the majority, in the minority. And that's regardless of who you are, because we all have privilege, but the only way you grow is being in those places. What's important when you're in those places, Blaine, is, you know, feel okay with what may feel like, you know, maybe privilege or dominance. But the thing that we don't do in those places is be responsive by listening to learn versus wanting to speak. And I say this in all due respect, Blaine, this is not about you, but sometimes when we're in places, we want to make people feel comfortable. We want to feel like we're right. So sometimes it's best to just grow in that space of silence, grow in that space of not knowing, because you don't have to have the answer. And the answer may not be that you need to help them be comfortable or thankful. It's a space for you to grow. And my boss, our CEO, Doug Harris, says, a lot of times we'd rather be right than to grow. And so it's a space of growth, and take that as an opportunity as opposed to just being a challenge. And I applaud you for putting yourself in a space like that, because it's uncomfortable, but that's where cultural confidence comes from. Great question.
Eric, give me the flip opposite, because I want to make sure we get to Blaine's the essence of Blaine's question. So the other side of that is basically what it was saying is when Blacks were there in an all white, or when Blacks are the minority in a situation, he wants to make them feel comfortable as well and reciprocate that feeling of comfort that he feels when he goes to a diverse environment. So what's your thoughts there?
That's a great point, and I'm sorry if I missed that thread of that. So if you see someone, one of the things that I used to coach our executives is learning how to reach. And you know, and sometimes we think that reaching is, you know, giving. It's a 51% proposition, Blaine. If you give, they're probably going to give back more. It's like a smile. When you smile at people, 99% of the times they smile back. But when you see someone that's the only person, you need to reach to them. And when you reach that sentiment, is much bigger than you can ever imagine, especially when they're in the minority. And I can tell you, and I'm sure we've been in a space, when you're in a place where you're the only, you'd love for someone to come up to you and say something, welcome you, make you feel comfortable. That is a way of reaching, creating trust, and it's lowering the waterline that I talked about. You expose a little more of you in a way that, you know, may seem uncomfortable, but then they'll lower some of their waterline and you'll get to see. Because typically, what do we usually ask people? You know, where are you from? So those are things that are easy conversations, but more importantly, it gives people access to begin to build trust, which is the biggest barrier that we have when we think about this work.
Absolutely.
Great question.
Yeah, I think to add to that, you know, I worked in corporate America in technology space. So there's lots of times I was in executive meetings, board meetings, or conferences, and being the only Black male in the room. And I think the thing that made me feel the most comfortable in those situations is really, like I said, someone coming up to you even afterwards, you know, saying hello, and not necessarily making a big deal about it, but just having a conversation, asking me how you doing, you know, how's your family, where you from. And having a conversation, that's what makes people feel comfortable and make you feel like you're a part, included, you know. And I think that's really the thing that people like, and people really appreciate.
Absolutely. That's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah. One of the questions that I have, Eric, when I think of unconscious bias, I think the group that does it probably the least amount is children. So when I think about kids, they are kids. That's the innocence of it. They will play with anybody. When I think back on our daughter, when she was little, she would, as long as it was a human body, she did not care if they didn't speak her language, what color. I love that about children. So the question that I have is, how can we better manage our unconscious bias? How can we be more like children?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we're going to talk about managing that a little bit. But one of the examples that I think, and I say this to us as adults, not as children, you know, Jeff Bezos said in a graduation speech to one, we always have choices. And when we have choices in this society, we've been driven to have the choice to be smart or be clever. We don't think about the choice of being kind. So when you think about how young kids act, if they do something that's maybe not kind, it's not intentional. But we have choices to where we can choose to, you know, I'm going to be the smartest person in the room, or I'm going to be kind. And if you choose to be kind, that's more embracing than saying I'm more intelligent. Because being, as I said before, being right is more important to us than growing. And that's the space that as adults, we create that. As young children, they have less concern about being right until we teach them that, and more concern about making a friend and being kind.
Yeah. What are ways that we can help people address biases that they are just not aware of?
Well, that's where we step into, and we're going to talk about conscious inclusion. When you're not aware of it, you got to think about, you know, who do I know and where have I been? So I would ask folks this question, and you could write it with your non-dominant hand. Pre-COVID, how many people that are not your ethnic background did you see on a daily basis outside of work? Then I'd ask you, pre-COVID, how many people that are not your ethnic background did you see in a week outside of work? And you could put that in a month. My point would be, if you're not exposed, and we're going to talk about this, if you're not exposed and if you're not putting yourself in a position, you're not. My grandmother used to say that people are acquaintance. They're not a friend until they put their feet under your table. So if people haven't eaten, and so I think that's not just an African American or Black experience. Most times when you know someone, you're invited to eat, or they're invited to eat. And food is one of those nurturing aspects of how we come, and it lowers the waterline around culture. It's one of the things we do the most. but we tend to, is why I'm not as excited about food things, because we eat the food and go home. We don't think about, maybe I need to know more than just the food. But I would say getting to know people in your space and their space is the best way to lower the waterline and get beyond unconscious bias. Just what you want is for people to share with you. And sometimes you'll realize, I know I do, there's things I thought about someone and I was totally wrong once I got to know them. But I had that bias.
Yeah. So here's a good one. How do you lower the waterline at work?
A great question. Great question. So one, it's amazing how, let's think about the evolution. And I don't want to offend any of the HR people. It used to be, what you didn't talk about at work? Politics and religion. And that may still be a rule, but it's not happening. It happens all the time. And my point would be, getting to know people at work has to do with what you value. And there's affinity. And whether someone's red, black, blue, or green, male or female, when you have affinity, you do things that are the same, you're going to connect either way. It's sort of like the people in HR sort of know people in HR maybe a little bit better than the people maybe in operations or risk management. Why? Because they have affinity around things they like. So forget about race and gender. If you want to be successful in an organization, if you stay in your function and don't learn the rest of the business, what? You're not going to grow. So you have to find a way at work to go to different places in the building to learn not just race and gender, but to learn the business. So if we had that same kind of acknowledgement and I saw someone at work that I didn't know, my motivation to grow in a company would cause me to what? I need to talk to that guy in marketing so that I understand marketing if I'm not in marketing. So why wouldn't we do that with people who we don't know? So that we better understand not only them, but you can learn their view of the business as well, which might be different. And the other thing that I think in the workplace that we have to think about doing, and I'm again more focused on strategy and structure, the more functional diversity you have, the more ethnic and other aspects of diversity. Meaning if you have lines between functions, then you're going to have lines between people. And the best place that I would align, I spent a lot of time in mergers and acquisitions, and I did work on the role of diversity in mergers and acquisitions in the early 2000s when acquisitions were big. And we know the reasons acquisitions don't work is because of people, not because the money doesn't add up. So if you work for a company and I work for a company and they're merged, we would have less affinity about being Black and more affinity about what? Our company.
Yeah.
So if you never cross lines, and if you and I met before we merged, we probably connect around the business. But when you got a line there and we don't take the time to get to know them, even in a business context, you're not good. And again, understand what I'm saying. The reaching is important. And people in power, people with privilege you don't reach, they create a wall that it's okay for that to be that divisive. Makes sense. That's a great question.
Yeah. So when again, back to diversity, and again, back to my experience. So when working in corporate America, a lot of times what I would see is like diversity at the lower end of the organization, right? So kind of a pyramid where the diversity was at the bottom. The higher you go, the less diversity that you would see. So if you're a leader in an organization or a company that has that, so let's say your entire leadership staff happens to be white males, what can you do?
Well, I had instructions for most of the CEOs I worked for, especially in this space, and I had several that I would call A students. One, you can't manage any organization from the top and not go to the point of execution. And we're going to be mostly at the point of execution. And anything that you say, you need to go to the end of the organization, my old CEO say, and listen to what people say about what you just said at the point of execution. And then you know. But leaders who don't spend time at all levels won't know their organization, regardless of the ethnicity. The diversity of levels is what you're missing. And if you say you want to be diverse and inclusive and you don't spend time with the people at all levels and you know there's ethnic diversity there or gender diversity there or any type of diversity, that's shame on you as a leader. Because it goes back to leaders want to be good And a CEO, sometimes we make them, experts at what they do. You got to give them room to grow. They're not going to be expert in this subject because we're not. None of us are experts, and there's not perfection. So, as a CEO, you should be at those points of execution where the most diversity is. Those relationships usually tell you more than you want to know, not only about them as a diverse person, but about the business. So you got to be in places in the business that are different than just the people you see. And I know CEOs are busy, leaders are busy.
Right.
I say this respect to all CEOs. They're all busy until something bad happens and you got to testify.
Right.
And that's not a space that I like to operate in. I haven't, and it's not a space that I would love, for any of my CEOs to be in.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. So let's move on to the next section here.
This is getting good.
This is getting good.
Conscious inclusion.
This gets to action. And so conscious inclusion, when you look at conscious inclusion, it says experience, exposure, immersion. So I've talked about some of this, and experience, exposure, immersion, it talks about being in different places with different people, experiencing different things. So let's think about organizations' continuum of success. Intelligence is IQ, and we said people have to be intelligent to be successful. EQ was emotionally smart. Now CQ, culturally smart. So to become culturally competent, you got to experience different people. So the CEO I talked about, if he doesn't know the experience of people at all levels, he's got to be exposed, meaning you can't just experience, you got to be exposed to different people. Then you got to immerse yourself in different places. Blaine talked about being in a place where he's a minority. If you've ever traveled to another country and you're a minority, you know and understand what it's like to be immersed in a different culture where you're not in power, you're not in control, and you got to respond to the culture the way they respond. That's when change happens the most dynamic. And we most times avoid being in places where we're not in control. So unless you get, and everyone heard others say this, and me said, unless you get comfortable with being uncomfortable, you don't change. So when we look at what's happening right now in society and all that's happening around racial justice and social justice, it's a fact that we've not as a culture spent time in different places other than where we're comfortable. And if we don't move that, then you're not going to become conscious or culturally competent. Now, I want to move us to the last slide so that we can wrap up and see if there's any final questions. To become consciously inclusive, there are competencies that are pretty straightforward. The first one is demonstrating empathy. And I would ask us, do we know and understand how to honor others and their experiences? And do we put ourselves in a place to do that? Communicating authentically. Start by listening to hear and learn versus listening to speak. And we get to a certain level, we hear certain things, and the first thing that comes to mind is my response. Here's a nugget. In this space, you don't have to be perfect because you're not. So sometimes the best way to respond is to say, I don't know. And when you say, I don't know, then that communication is going to be best. Embracing differences. When people aren't like you, you don't have to be wrong for me to be right. And understanding that. So embrace different point of views. The other is managing privilege. Most of us, regardless of who we are, there's some level of privilege that we have. Are we aware of it and are we managing it? And the last one, act courageously. Right now, there's a huge need for courageousness in this space. Allyship is one of the things that is being asked, and that is standing up for people who may be able to stand for themselves, but they're not even being listened to. So how do you create a space where you can act courageously? So demonstrating empathy, communicating authentically, listening, embracing differences, listening so you can learn from people, but also if they've got a different point of view, embrace it as opposed to deny it because it's not yours. Managing privilege, recognize that most of us, and I would say most people on this phone, we're privileged in some way. Do we understand that privilege? And then lastly, acting courageous. And so those would be the the things that I would say as we think about this work. I'll jump to Q&A, but what I'd like for those who have been writing with their non-dominant hands, I'd like for you to maybe take a look at what that looks like, how hard it was, or maybe difficult it was. The other thing I would say to you, even if you were challenging to do it, it was a physical act, but you didn't lose any cerebral capability. So think about if someone was working with you and they typed and it took them a long time, or if they wrote something and it didn't look pretty. We're focused on things being the way we are as opposed to difference. And just with a simple change, you're not as perfect as you think you were when you were writing with your dominant hand. And the reality is what? If you took the time to do that, or if you never got control of your dominant hand, guess what? You perfect that. You'd get good at writing with that hand. So when it comes to change in this work, if you stay in it and do it, you'll grow. But we typically would choose to go back to our dominant hands. We won't learn. And that's what's difficult about this work. We're too comfortable being where we are. We're not immersed enough in those difficult places. And this was just an exercise to show how comfortable it is being who we are, how uncomfortable it is understanding someone else's situation. So what questions do we have? What other questions do we have?
Awesome, thank you.
Eric, I have been sitting here writing with my left hand, and it really looks horrible. But
She needs some practice, Eric. I would love to see in the chat, put in the chat how hard or easy it was for you to write with your dominant hand. If you haven't tried writing with your dominant hand, go ahead and give it a try. We do have a question from Brian, which I think is a great one.
Okay.
What's a good example of how to demonstrate empathy without being offensive?
Good question.
Ah, great. So the first thing, and it's a great question. The first thing about demonstrating empathy, I go back to the iceberg, is lowering your waterline. So you engage people from where you are, and that is going to sort of test to show how well do I know myself? How comfortable am I in going and approaching John in a place to show empathy? Because that's probably at times it's for John, but in our head, is it for me? And that's unfortunately where we go from. So I got to lower my waterline. I got to understand myself, think about who I am. And as I lower my waterline, then I have greater access to John and I can make him feel comfortable. And empathy doesn't seem in any way patronizing or offensive. It's engaging. But you can't do that by just walking up to people. And I love the question because people with good intent and good people, they want to be empathetic. But that's where sometimes unconscious bias slips in, is when I don't know myself in the context of John, because I could be righteously wanting to help him, but I don't know him. So I need to make sure, do I know myself? And why is it that I don't know John in a space where I can help him, but I don't know him? That's where you got to check yourself. Good question.
Yeah. And Eric, I have a question. How do you know when you're becoming more culturally competent?
You know, it's interesting because it sort of goes back to the children, but let's just think about the fact that when we're in places where we're uncomfortable and then all of a sudden we're comfortable. So I think about, forget diversity, but just anything that's new. Like when I first went to college, I went there and I was uncomfortable. Well, after certain days, I was okay. And 4 years and it doesn't matter. But when you're in a place where you're uncomfortable, you have to have the resilience to stay there. And right now, it's one of the challenges that we don't have. And cultural competence is so easy to pick up on when you find that I have different people, I'm in different places, I'm doing different things than I did last year. And when we do the same things, then we're not going to grow. And cultural competence, again, I want us to say, it's not just ethnic or gender. It's the culture that you're used to being in. It's the places that you're used to being around that make you feel comfortable. And if you don't go there, and I'll be specific, in our city, we're very geographically segregated. But it's just some people don't go. And For whatever, they don't go to certain parts of the city. You'll never know that culturally unless you go there. You have to be there.
Mhm.
Here's a great question that follows up on this one, and it was by anonymous, so I can't give credit to the question. But here's the question: had a leader asked me recently, what are the practical ways to have people experience what it's like to be a minority when they are part of the majority? This non-dominant hand example was a great example, but what are other things we can use to teach others?
Okay, so I think, and I don't mean this, we have to move theory out of the way and we have to move books out of the way. So if you want to get to know someone, you need to get to know them in a realistic way. So if you want to know about what it's like to be a Black person in corporate America, one, you can't wait until there's a problem to come and ask me. First, you got to do it in an intuitive way. So it isn't maybe asking what it's like, it's talking about the work. They're there to work. So do you understand what their work and their job is? Talk to them in the context that's relevant to not just who they are, but where they are and what they're trying to accomplish. And then thirdly, this goes back to this work is personal work. You first got to ask yourself, why is it I don't know at this point what it's like to be a Black person in corporate America, especially if you're in an executive level. And there's not many people that are at a senior level that ask a person at a junior level, red, black, blue, or green, to meet with me that they're not going to show up. But the conversation doesn't need to be what it's like to be a Black person. The conversation could be, what do you think about talk about the business, talk about what they want to do. You don't have to go to the ethnic piece. And I know that there's been a sense of leaders wanting to get this right and do better. But the first thing that most leaders have to acknowledge is I don't have the answer. So there's been a lot of listening sessions where leaders have said, I want to meet with the African-American population, or I'm going to meet with a certain group of population, the diverse population, and understand what their experience is like. That gets tiring. Why don't you meet with them and have a conversation about the business? They don't typically have that. So talk to them about the business and you might hear some of what it's like. Because the thing that I think, and the other thing is, don't just do it now, create a system that does it. I had a CEO who had, this thing, Coffee with Derek. That wasn't his name, I won't let it see, but Coffee with Derek. And people at all levels came, and he didn't talk about their levels, he didn't talk about their race, he talked about the business. I can remember him coming out and saying to me, it's amazing that we don't have any women of color at the director level. And he figured that out when he said that every director that he met with that were women were all white. So he asked for the data. Had he asked for the data and said, Eric, do we have any women of color as directors? You immediately go to reaction. So intuitively, he thought about it strategically around the business. So these are my experiences, and they may sound simple. The key that I would say to most people when you want to learn is just be open to growing as opposed to being the expert. Because, hearing from me what it's like to be a Black person in corporate America is not John's experience.
Yeah. I think it's really neat. Your answers were spot on there. Really just having conversations, being open enough to have a conversation with someone that's different.
Right.
And the way to find out is to sit down and have coffee, break bread, or do whatever. And again, you could talk about sports or children or kids, and eventually you'll get around to understanding that person better. And you don't have to go in with like, hey, what is it?
Right.
What does it feel to be Black?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what it feels like to be Black.
Go back to my example of Jeff Bezos. Have that conversation to be kind, not to be clever. You're not looking to be smart about people. You want to be kind.
You want to be kind. Yeah.
And I think even like from my past experience in healthcare, we were kind of forced to be culturally competent because when patients came in, it doesn't make a difference what ethnic group, what religion they believe in, what color. it's about, at the end of the day, that's when you can really see the humanity. Hey,
Right.
someone cut you, you bleed just like me. So I think working in healthcare has really helped me with being culturally competent and being able to see everyone as one. And at the end of the day, we all want happiness. We all want to be well. Yeah, we all want to be successful. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a really great point, comment in the chat there. Is like, the comment basically said, I don't believe it's truly a way for a white person to experience what it's like to be Black, which again, I mean, that's a reality, right? I wouldn't know what
it's like to be white,
or what it's like to be white or a woman,
literally.
right? I mean, I can't experience that, but I can get to know people.
Right.
I can be open about it, and I think it's all about our open-mindedness and how we come to.
That's a great point. Yeah, I coach executives not to, and anyone, don't say, walk a mile in my shoes. I want to walk in your shoes, because you can't.
Right. Right.
Walk with me and beside me, not in my space.
Man, Eric, I could talk to you all day.
I know. We look at the time.
We got about 4 minutes to wrap up here. We're gonna run this thing over. So, Eric, give me your just your last thoughts. What are you thinking? Just give me some last words.
Well, one, I want to thank you guys for having this opportunity to have the dialogue. I want to thank those in attendance for using their non-dominant hand and processing that. And then lastly, I would say, we're going to have a follow-up session, and we ended on conscious inclusion and cultural competence. Think about those 5 areas of conscious inclusion. Which one would you focus most on, do you need to work on more than anything? Think about those 5 areas. And when we come back together for our next session, we're going to take a deep dive on how we can be intentional in being consciously inclusive, how we can be more culturally competent. And what do we do to make sure that happens in a way in our corporations and in our personal lives?
Thank you, Eric. Thank you.
Yes, we really appreciate that. All right. Thank you all for joining us. As John said, gosh, the time go by so fast.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, we're in a good conversation. But thank you for joining us for the 13th segment of YBLA Community Conversation. We hope you gained some insight about how to create a workplace of diversity and inclusion, and just in your lives of how to be more culturally competent. We want to thank our amazing panelist, Eric Watson, for facilitating our session today. We also want to thank our wonderful partners at DHG.
Oh, you guys are so awesome. Yeah. So the next segment will be on Tuesday, December 1st. December 1st. Eric will be back. Yeah.
Part 2.
I'm so excited. We get to go deeper and deeper. So Eric will be back to give us part 2 of this. We invite you to invite your coworkers, your friends, your families. Tell them to join us. This is amazing information. As I see in the chat here, you guys did a wonderful job. Thank you for the chat. Thank you, Abuna there.
Yeah.
We're going to learn. We're going to pick us up. How do we get towards system level change, right?
That's
it. We're pushing the actions. We're pushing our goals. Right. We're going to get to our 2020 actions goals. We will be there.
Yes, literally it takes one person at a time.
Yep.
Right.
So if your company is interested in additional training in DE&I, please email us. Let us know at stanclt@youngblackleadership.org.
We're here to help.
We would love to help. And
absolutely.
As John said, it's gonna take all of us to make the change.
I want to send a special shout out to my new friend Brian from Belk.
Yes,
Brian, thank you for joining us. We actually had an opportunity to sit down with the folks from Belk and do a session with them. They are a wonderful group. So thank you guys for joining us. They always show up strong too.
Yes,
so
they do.
Thank you guys for being there.
All right. And please join us next time, December the 1st. And don't forget to fill out your feedback, the survey that we sent out, because we are really we're very committed to making a change and continuing this conversation in 2021 because we want to see the change happen.
Stand 21.
Closing the gap.
Closing the gap. That's what we're going to do next year. Stand 21. So
next year,
you guys give us some feedback on who you want to hear from, the types of things that you guys want to hear.
Nationwide.
We are committed to continuing to close the gap. This is such important information. This is such important work. We're definitely committed to getting it done.
Absolutely. We got some trees to plant.
We have some trees to plant.
Yeah.
We're sitting in shade right now.
Yeah.
And we got some trees to
We got
plant.
some more trees.
We are perfectly on the dot of 1 o'clock.
All right,
Everybody
everyone.
have a wonderful day. Hopefully you guys enjoyed your lunch eating left-handed.
That's right.
Yeah. Have a great day. Thanks again, Eric.
All right.
Blessings.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thanks so much. Thanks for the great work you're doing.
Yeah, you can hold on, Eric.